Well, you know what they say, new year, new me. But for me that isn't really true, as the mastering chain that I've been using hasn't really changed since last year. I mean, I know that we're only a week in, but usually around this time, I start frantically thinking about all of the things that I can improve in my workflow. And of course, one of the things that you can improve would be your mastering chain, which is this guy over here. This is just a temporary one in a production project that I'm working on, but this would be a good example to emulate the finished track, even though it technically isn't. Because for this track, I'm already happy with all of the drums and I'm fairly close with where I want the mix to be. Of course, I'm going to go into a separate mixing stage, but that's going to be later on after I finish my album, which this track is not a part of. Anyway, the reason why my mastering chain has always stayed the same is because I've been thinking about it more in the sense of functionalities rather than in individual plugins. And in this case, I would say my mastering stage contains 4 different kind of stages of processing. We have the gluing part, we have the fixing part, we have the clipping part, and then we have the final loudness. And within these stages, the plugin that you use for every stage doesn't really matter. Of course, they're going to have workflow differences and slight sound differences. But at the stage of mastering, you're not going to make changes that are so significant to like the tonality of the track or to the balance between elements and that kind of stuff. That has already been established within the mix. So at the end of the day, the mastering is really going to impact the details, especially when you look at the earlier stuff like the gluing and the fixing, which is essentially just EQ balancing the track. So I'm quickly going to play just a part of the track with the mastering removed. And as you can hear, this is quite an aggressive track, so we're going to need a little bit more aggressive mastering. With an EDM dance track, that is almost always going to be the case, that you want a little bit of extra loudness out of your master. But it is also nice to just increase the amount of gluing that you're using, and sometimes you just have to go into the EQ to fix certain things. In this case, that is not the case. These are just here as placeholders so that you can see that there's an extra stage for me potentially here. And then as I said, the last 2 stages really never change for me in the way that they work. I tend to use a clipper before a limiter in order to get the loudness that I want. And the clipper is really here to get those kind of occasional peaks that you may run into, whereas the limiter is more for the overall loudness that you're trying to achieve. That being said, let's start with the Shadow Hills mastering compressor and actually take a look at the settings. So the Shadow Hill mastering compressor is basically 2 compressors into one. You have the optical segment over here, and then you have the discrete segment over here. And they both handle the material a little bit differently. To be honest, I'm not really familiar with the inner workings and that kind of stuff. I just kind of follow the manual, which says to aim for a 1 dB gain reduction for the optical compressor. And I want a 2 dB gain reduction for the discrete compressor with this specific ratio attack and release settings over here. Now I do sometimes like to experiment with it, but just having a manual and a recipe to follow that usually gets you good results is really nice. And that is just part of knowing the plugin. That is just part of kind of knowing what kind of response you're going to get from it. What I know from this plugin is that it will become a little bit more weightier. Now I have volume balanced this plugin, so what we can do is we can just bypass it and hear the difference. Now you might be able to hear that. I don't know how well it's going to come across with YouTube compression and whatnot, and it's also going to depend obviously on your listening environment. So if you have been listening on your phone, it may be good to switch back to headphones and re-listen to that example, or quickly hop on your studio computer and try your monitors. or maybe in your car or at work. It really doesn't really matter as long as you give me more views. Now the next stage would normally be the fixing part. This is where I go into the mix and kind of rebalance it to where it needs to be. Sometimes I just do that by ear, but other times I use a plugin for that. I have this Sonable True Balance here, which I can use to analyze reference tracks as well as my own track. But in this case, as I said, I didn't really do that step, mainly because this is a temporary master that I'm just checking mainly for the loudness. You can see that there's an EQ in front of it. This is just from the production stage, so I'm going to turn this off when I export for mixing. And of course, once I have my mix done, I go into my actual master, and there I spend actual time listening to the mix and seeing if I can make those minute little detail changes in the EQ. And then I would need to go into the next stage, which is going to be the clipping stage. Now, what I really want to achieve here is just cutting out those very limited peaks that you sometimes get when two sounds just kind of sum together in a weird way. Like you can imagine with the amount of channels that are here and a lot of the randomization that is used within all of these processes that are used to generate these sounds. Like even a reverb is like technically random and all of that kind of stuff. You'd never really know where the sound is going to go. And one of the things that I don't really want to do is use something like the clip to zero mixing strategy, because that is really designed for more louder forms of EDM, like the dubstep and the drum and bass and that kind of stuff, the stuff that can really distort. Whereas Psytrance really still likes to be nice and dynamic. If I zoom into this here, you can see that it's not technically like squared off or anything. It is loud, don't get me wrong. You can see that we're using the whole waveform here. This is just a recording that I made earlier. But you can see even in the fills here, we like to be dynamic. We like to sometimes just have it a lot quieter and then go back up again. All of that stuff doesn't really feel right for something like clip to zero. But you still need to deal with all of those little small spikes of sounds that you're sometimes going to get. And if you let your mastering limiter deal with that, it has to work a lot harder in order to catch those individual small transients. And that usually leads to a lot more distortion. So really what we're trying to do is use this two-stage approach where we essentially have these two plugins in series. So as you can see, I'm boosting it into this hard clipper over here. So this is going to clip at 0 dB, which is the ceiling that we've set here. And then we lower it down again so that this plugin has enough space to work with it and do its magic. And then this is boosting it up again to minus 0.1 dB. So that we have that little bit of extra headroom left. We're not going to go to 0 dB. We're not going to go over it. We're also using true peak limiting. So there's no intersample peaks that go into it as well. So that's really my master chain. Now there's going to be a next segment to this video because I know that I spat a lot of words at you and you may not know exactly what it means to like talk about true peak loudness, talk about different forms of measurement, talking about different stages, talking about intersample peaks, all of that kind of stuff. So I feel like I want to just sit down and talk a little bit about loudness, but I don't feel like I am the right guy to do that. At the end of the day, my mastering strategy is just make it louder right up until the part where it starts to distort. I'm not the kind of guy that makes crazy loud music, but I'm also not the kind of guy that makes sophisticated music where the loudness is never really just pushed up until it sounds good. To put it in a little bit more technical terms, for those that know the LUFS measurement system, when we talk about tracks that are like -14 to -10 LUFS, what you tend to do in the master is a lot more the processing and the gluing of it all together. You don't really care about how loud it's going to be because your loudness isn't going to be, a significant aspect of the actual track. It's much more focused on the music itself. And you tend to get a lot of punch out of the dynamics that way. Whereas those tracks that are mastered at -2 LUFS, that really loud stuff, as I said, that really distorted stuff, it tends to be the case also with hardstyle and raw style and whatnot. All of those really aggressive genres, those tend to benefit a lot from the extra distortion. And they're setting up a master and even a mix towards a master that is able to do that and still sounds clean is very, very complicated. And Psytrance at -8 LUFS roughly is, as I said, kind of in between, where we're still pushing the loudness to get a nice overall loud mix, and we're using loudness to our advantage to sound better. We never really get into the territory where we really have to know what we're doing exactly, and we have to think about the loudness throughout the whole mixing strategy. We can mix a little bit more relaxed. Sometimes you have to clip something off, like mainly my hats I tend to do that with. A little bit of clipping on those transients can go a long way in your mixing stage. But like I said, after that we have this fairly basic chain here, which just makes sure that our track is nice and loud. And in this case I use one extra plugin that is a little bit of a personal preference that you don't really have to use for the gluing. So I guess one of the main takeaways is that for Psytrance we are kind of lucky that we are in that in-between spot where you don't really have to learn that much about, the very complex stuff, as I said before. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not the right person to really talk about loudness and give you all of the technical talk about it. So what I would suggest for most of you that want to master your own stuff and you really want to get into it and learn it is 1, experiment, find that workflow of plugins that works for you. 2, consume a little bit of content in each direction. Check out some videos in regards to really loud masters and how you get really loud stuff like Bathrometrics' Clip to Zero method. Or check out some of the teachings from some more traditional mixing engineers like Dan Worrell. It sounds funny saying teachings like he is some kind of religious figure, but then again, he is kind of a god at what he does. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. I really wanted to make this video because somebody asked about it on an older version of this video. And in seeing that, I realized that my mastering chain had changed a lot since I made that last video, what was 4 years ago now. So I hope that you guys enjoyed it and that you learned something useful. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed to the channel. Another way to support me is to do so financially, which you can do over on my Patreon page. So if you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link in the description. But that's going to be it. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.